Okay, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening in the live Zoom room, and to those who are following us on YouTube, and those who will be following this talk perhaps further down the road. This is the final talk in the EVA alumni series of the spring 2022 season. And we're really delighted to have Annika Lübbert with us this evening, who was a 2017 EVA alumni grant awardee. And so, as many of you know, this series was really established as an effort to showcase not just the research projects and research outcomes of recipients of the European Varela Award, but also highlight some of the story behind these young researchers' project. And so we'll hear from Annika about a very specific aspect of her research on social interactions this evening, and also a little bit about her own trajectory. So before we launch in, I'd just like to introduce Annika for those who don't know her. So Annika Lübbert completed a BA in Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University College in Maastricht, a dual Masters of Science in Brain and Mind Sciences at the University College London, as well as the Université Pierre-Marie Curie and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. She did her Ph.D. on the investigation of social interaction as a multi-level phenomenon at the Department of Neurophysiology and Pathophysiology at the University Medical Center in Hamburg and Eppendorf. During her PhD, Annika co-developed 2 projects to strengthen embodied and participatory approaches in science, notably the Playful Academic and the Mindful Researchers Initiative. And besides her research, Annika works as a trainer with HFP Consulting, supporting scientists to be effective, inclusive, and authentic leaders. And on a very important note, Annika will be defending her thesis tomorrow, so we'll all collectively be wishing her good luck in that endeavor. So with that, Annika, I will give you the floor for the presentation. And thanks so much again, once again, for sharing this story with us this evening.
Yeah, thanks so much, Johanna, also for this introduction. Yeah, it is a lot going on for me these days, but I already can share that it's a wonderful opportunity to have to give this talk today, also as a preparation for tomorrow, and in preparing for this event, as well as a job interview actually, and the thesis tomorrow, I sort of organized a lot of my ideas around research and also how I want to work in the future. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I guess I would dive right in and start with the presentation that I have prepared. So let me share my slides. All right, so you should now see the title. So the title of this talk is Embodied and Interaction Dynamics, Empirical Investigation and Applied Projects. So, and as Johanna also mentioned, I really will focus on one of the main findings that I have from this experiment that I will present today, and also other research that I did, which evolves around a balance. So a balance between synchrony and also difference or variation that I observe in my findings. So basically I selected what I present to you today to really support, to show you the findings that support this general conclusion. All right, so as part of my PhD, I really tried to investigate social engagement in the laboratory. So let me start. So what is the relevance of doing this kind of work? I think it's quite clear to say that engaging in and maintaining successful or productive social interactions is key. So we know this from studies that show like over the course of life, that long life or also happy life, one of the key factors that contributes to this is like an intact social network. But also we know this from our everyday interactions, that most of the things we do, we really depend on other people, or we do them together with other people. So it seems that understanding what successful social engagement, which factors really contribute to that, is definitely relevant. The challenge, I say, is to study this process in the laboratory. So it is useful to sort of use reduced settings to be able to measure key dynamics and also be able to formulate clear hypotheses and also clear results. So these reduced settings are sort of a key ingredient of being able to observe processes in this controlled and like rigorous manner. But the moment we move into such a setting, it becomes difficult to really facilitate genuine engagement and interaction between participants. So that was really the challenge that I faced in my PhD. How can I facilitate genuine engagement, but at the same time really observe the key dynamics that are happening between, in this case, my participants. So the research questions that I was following really evolve around how social cognition is anchored in embodied interaction dynamics. So I will explain a bit more about the background where I come from in a moment. And then also I was interested in the factors that impact social engagement the most. And really the basic approach and also the research subject as I view it is that we learn and relate as humans by establishing a shared mode of exploration. So basically in the laboratory settings, and you will see in the experiment that I will present to you in a moment, I really think that participants learned like to establish a meaningful relation between one another and also learn to orient in this sort of game environment that I put them in by establishing a shared mode of exploration. And I think these, like a shared mode of exploration, how do we get there? There are basically two components. So you need to provide structure, and I could apply this to my talk. So I need to prepare well and invite you to sort of consider a particular perspective. And in the same instance, or like in the same way, participants, when they want to enter into a shared mode of exploration or just people engaged in an interaction, they have to make proposals. So put a suggestion into the space so that other people can relate to this. The other component that is important is to listen. So to leave space for the other, the unexpected, and maybe also the things that are different. So different from what I consider important or what I expected. So I hope that I will also comply to these, or like live up to these standards in the talk. So I have about 30-35 minutes lecture that I prepared. There will be around like 2 to 5 minutes of a group activity. There will also be time, like 10 minutes for you to exchange, just in pairs and breakout groups. And then I hope we have 20 minutes or more, like hopefully more time, open dialogue with the group. All right, so now let me elaborate a little bit more on the theoretical background that informed my work. I would say there are maybe two strands within cognitive science. So my research, I would situate it in cognitive science, and they're a bit like two perspectives. So there's a more like mental representations, symbolic, abstract reasoning strand. And then there's another strand that focuses more on the embodiment of cognition, or also on the distributed nature and how it's situated in the environment and in our interactions with others, and not only, let's say, in the representations that we accumulate in our brains, let's say. Okay, and let me go into a bit more detail. So what the 4E cognition, it says here. So what do these components mean? I would say that embodied cognition tries to draw our attention to the fact that we do have a body, and we are also emotional, in the sense that our affect, so how we respond to situations, is even an important part of very complex and abstract reasoning. So, I mean, there are findings also that show specifically that when we have damage to areas in the brain that are related to affectivity, that also harms our ability to make complex decisions that have nothing to do with emotions or social reasoning, such as investing money. So that really our reasoning apparatus, or like what we think, is really influenced by our embodied state, so whether we are well rested, and also affectivity plays a big role in structuring our thinking. The second point, that cognition is embedded, really emphasizes that the environment that we are in contributes to our reasoning and decision making. And I will show, well, part of my research really demonstrated that the environment structures also coordinate how we relate to other people. But I think also from a more abstract point of view, we can relate to this idea that how we are recognized by the people in our environment, for example, influences the roles that we can take, but also whether we are in a light or dark place, or the temperature even of the space really influences our cognitive functions. And to introduce a bit more the extended dimension of cognition, this would really refer also to tools that we use. So just having a pen and a paper ready as you're listening to this talk might really facilitate understanding or also developing your thinking around what I'm saying. But it also relates to collaborating and maybe coming to an idea, a creative realization as a group, that some things are just, there are processes that we realize that go beyond our individual brains and bodies. And finally, this point of enaction, so that cognition is enacted. Here I put down that it's a path led down in walking. So it's something, cognition is not something that is set in stone and executed, but it's just something that really happens in action, through action, and is also co-constituted. So part of my cognitive capacity lies in the interactive dynamics I have with other people, for example. And this is so what I said so far is like a very broad approach to cognitive processes, but my work as a PhD student was situated in a very particular lab or a consortium. So I was part of a European research consortium that set out to expand a certain theory, so the theory of sensory motor contingencies, to expand that to the social realm. So what are sensory motor contingencies? They really focus, they focus on especially the enacted dimension of cognition. So they draw a close loop between sensing and acting. And for example, would explain such a capacity as seeing, not as detecting patterns in the world and recognizing a pattern and detecting it and having an internal representation of this quality, but more as a mode of exploring. So seeing as the dependencies of, for example, eye movement to visual input. So I learn about the regularities of sensing and acting, and that's what I perceive. And so what could this mean to expand that to the social realm? It could really, so they make the claim, basically we try to show that part of social cognition and social skills live or happen in an interaction dynamic. So how well we are coordinated maybe in a team should relate to how we experience this interaction, for example. So coming back really to the challenge, let's say, that I had set for myself, how can we observe social engagement in the laboratory if this is a process that, as I just tried to sort of explain, expands across diverse levels? My answer or my proposal was that I would empirically observe spontaneously emerging interactive states or dynamic between participants. And I used games, so I designed simple interactive games that I presented participants with, and then I used sort of multiple channels of observation and created detailed records of their interaction dynamic to understand better which factors really contribute to a successful interaction. And just to explain that I really put a special emphasis on participant participation, so that participants really felt engaged in what they were doing, maybe even learned something about themselves through the experiment. And I also really emphasized this in-depth experience assessment. So I used interviews and also asked participants to rate their experience after sort of each trial to make sure that I get a good understanding of how they experience this. And just to give you like an overview, so as part of my PhD, I conducted 2 experiments. One of them, like the ball game, was more goal-directed. So 2 participants were steering a ball around obstacles to collect as many coins as they could in limited time. And the other experiment, the sonified mirror game, which I will mainly focus on in this talk, is a more open-ended task. So the people had basically the only task that they were given was to create interesting movements and sounds together. But through both settings, I pursued the same research questions. Okay. And now, since I will be talking mostly about the sonified mirror game, that was really a transition, because I started out with the ball game experiment and then moved towards the mirror game. And that was really a conscious choice to have a more open-ended interaction dynamic. So in the ball game, it's more constrained and goal-oriented. In the mirror game, it's more open-ended and improvisational. To also maybe to shift the parameter that I mentioned in the beginning, like having structure, but also having open space, I thought it was important to give more space. What's new for me, also about this mirror game, was that I now assess the influence of the sensory feedback modality. So I, as you will see, I compared the interaction dynamic when people only had visual feedback or when they had auditory feedback or both. And this was something that I did not consider in the first experiment. And I really, really put an emphasis on in-depth experience assessment. Yeah, maybe more of a technical note. I also designed a shorter experiment and introduced ratings after each trial because we learned that basically from the first experiment. So now to introduce the sonified mirror game in a bit more detail. As I said, the task that participants were given is to create interesting movements and sounds together. Let me first go to the protocol actually. And they did that under different conditions. So here you can see the experimental protocol. So participants basically came to the lab and they received written and oral instructions about what they were about to do. And they also got a demo of the movement sonification, because as participants, basically they moved this bar that you can see on the right-hand side between the two wooden bars. They moved their avatar left and right. And that was basically the only action that they were doing in the game. So they were improvising, moving along a line together with their partner. And so the three different sensory feedback conditions, they basically mean either we only see two dashes moving left and right in the upper part of the black screen, or they see how both of them are moving in relation to each other, and they also generate sound feedback. And the sound feedback was designed such that when they are very close to one another and they move, they basically generate musical sounds. So orchestra instruments playing a tune. But when they would move apart, they more heard like a parking signal that would tell them where their partner is and direct them back towards each other. So that was basically the sound that they could improvise with. And throughout the experiment, so they played 27 trials, basically of improvising together under these different conditions. We always asked them after each trial, how was the last game? So whether they were really attending and whether it was fun and whether they felt that time passed by quickly. And we also asked them about the interaction with their partner. So they answered these 6 questions about their general experience of the game and also particularly their interaction with the partner. And at several instances of the game, we also gave them this map of emotions task. So as you can see, this little person and the magnets or words, labels around it, we used this as a way of assessing how their experience shifted over time. Okay, and in addition to the sensory feedback modality that varied over the course of this experiment, we also had different leadership instructions. So basically we told participants either to lead movement or to follow the movement of their partner, or that they could jointly improvise movement dynamics. And over the course of the experiment, I also interviewed participants. So first I had joint interviews, and then in the very end of the experiment, I conducted individual interviews with both participants. And I really want to emphasize again that my research interest is really in how people enter into relations and maintain an interesting interaction dynamic. And experiments such as the mirror game are really useful because they reduce the interaction dynamic to something very simple, like moving left and right with an avatar, but you still have sort of narratives going on between people. You have really social engagement. So it's a very useful tool to reduce, basically simplify the interaction, but still have sort of a very genuine social engagement. Okay, this is more details about the movement sonification. And here I just wanted to sort of give you a bit more details. Yeah, so we have 3 different sets. So over the line, when people moved together, the instruments would change, and there were different chords. So when you are moving in the right area, of the bar, you would hear this chord, which is like a very harmonic chord, so random notes from this chord. And as you transition to another area, like the next chord, you would hear like a glissando movement, sort of, and then the other chord. So they have different qualities, these chords, a bit more, let's say, happy or low. And then there's also a moment of tension at the transition between these chords. All right, so to come back to really what are the research questions that I was answering or trying to answer through this experiment. Very generally, I wanted to learn something about what are the key factors that impact social engagement. I also wanted to learn something about how social engagement as well as interpersonal coordination evolve over time, so over the course of this experiment. And very in particular, I asked whether we can predict social engagement, so these ratings that participants gave after each trial, can we predict them from how coordinated they move? So how did I go about doing this? So don't worry, you don't have to understand everything that is visualized here, just to give a complete overview of the modeling approach that I used to answer this question. Important for this talk will be the experience ratings of fluency and fun. So basically, as part of the ratings, participants really answered whether they felt that it was a fluent interaction or very chaotic and complex. And they also gave this rating of whether they felt that it was fun or boring. And importantly, as I introduced, there were these different game conditions. So either they were playing just with sound feedback, with sound and visuals, or just with visual feedback. And they were also told to lead or follow, or to jointly improvise. So I will compare these conditions. And in terms of coordination measures, so we had this data about where they were along the line over time. And we quantified the degree of coordination with them using all of these different measures. For example, the position and velocity differences between players at any given point in time, but also how synchronous they were moving. And when I say synchrony, I here mean a very specific measure of windowed leg cross correlation. So we basically took these time series of positions, so where people were, and we chunked them in little pieces so that we could really look at what's happening now and then and then. And then we shifted them in the temporal order so that we can calculate correlations, and we know at which leg the correlation is strongest. So then I can make a statement about who is leading the interaction dynamic and who's following. And synchrony is really this general average of correlation coefficients across all legs. So it's a very general assessment of how much people were moving in relation to each other. Whereas the strength of relation is a bit more specific in that it only looks at the strongest relationship between people at any moment in time, independent of the leg. So I'm just ignoring who is leading or following. I only look at the strength of relation between people. And the variability of relation, and this is the final parameter that I will introduce now to not overwhelm you with information at one point. The variability of relation really means then how variable is the strength of relation over time. So high variability of relation would mean that over the course of a trial, the people were sometimes really coordinated, and sometimes they were not coordinated at all. So that would mean high variability. Low variability would mean that they are either not coordinated the whole time, or that they are really coordinated the whole time. Okay. So what are the findings from these analyses? So looking at the models that we calculated to predict participants' fluency and fun ratings, we found that synchrony, so this very general assessment of how coordinated people are moving, is a significant predictor of both models. So when we are moving in a generally synchronous manner, we give higher ratings of synchrony, of fluency, and also of fun. So the interaction seems to be more fun when there's a general level of synchrony. We also see that switching, which is a parameter that relates to the leg. So switching means that sometimes I lead and sometimes you lead, and we go back and forth between this relationship. We don't have a very stable leader-follower relationship, but it flips around over time. And when there is a lot of flipping around who is the leader, that reduces fluency ratings after the trial. So both these findings are they make sense intuitively. We also found that the velocity differences contribute positively to fun, which is actually interesting. So when we move at different speeds, that is a fun interaction, but it reduces the sense of fluency. Again, this also makes intuitive sense, but it's interesting to note that being different, moving at different speeds, contributes positively to social engagement in a way. And we also see that, in fact, the feedback modality was basically the strongest influence on participants' ratings. So in particular, the presence of visual cues contributed positively to having fun and also feeling fluent. And in this particular case, it might really relate to the nature of the movement sonification, because it was not very predictable. So it was more like a random generator from a set of chords, from a set of instruments, rather than playing the piano, let's say, by going left and right. But I will also come back to this in a moment to go in more depth about the role of the sensory feedback modality. So basically, the rest that I will talk about, the results, will really focus on the influence of the sensory feedback modality, as well as changes that I see over time. So here I want to highlight already that fluency ratings tended to increase over the block of play. So that seems to indicate that participants managed to maybe, let's say, establish a shared mode of exploration, and hence experience the interaction dynamic as more fluent. Okay, now I will focus on the differences between the sensory feedback modalities. So there were really striking differences in how people moved when they had visual feedback or audiovisual or just auditory feedback. As you can see from as what these graphs want to show is, on the left side, there is an example trial of just having auditory feedback, and the blue line would be one player and the red line is another player. And from left to right is that moving through this one trial, which is 40 seconds long. And you can see that they don't move so fast. So compared to on the right-hand side in the visual trial, people are really moving a lot and very fast. They tend to move more slowly in auditory play. Audiovisual play indeed is a sort of a combination of the two. So we see faster movements as well as more coordinated movements. So in auditory play, there are big position differences that are not present in audiovisual play, which makes also a lot of sense given that they really had this direct feedback of an avatar moving in relation to one another. We also, when looking at the measures of coordination that are used to understand, really to quantify the degree of coordination between participants, we can summarize all of these findings, which I will show you in a moment, that auditory play is really marked by slow, delayed, and maybe even a bit stumbling or disrupted interaction. Audiovisual play, in turn, is marked by more fluent, coordinated, and strongly related movements. And finally, visual play is really fast, more let's say, boisterous and playful. And when we have leader-follower instructions, they are really very much present in the data. Whereas in auditory play, for example, when there's only auditory feedback, you really see in the movement coordination measures, but also from what participants shared in the interviews, that even as a leader, they were watching out to really be followable or even go back to the other person to have a chance of being together. So the leader-follower relations were much more dominant in the visual play and less so in the auditory play. Okay, and just to sort of show you the evidence, but I will not explain every detail that is visible on the slide now. Maybe just to take a general conclusion from this data is that we really see strong differences for all of these measures of coordination and even different patterns. So in a way, for people who work more in the field of coordination, knowing a little bit in more detail, it can be interesting to note that we really see these differences and also different differences across these measures between the different sensory feedback modalities. Okay, and as this is a recording, you can always go back and look in more detail, but for the sake of giving you a bit more information about other things, I will also move on now. Okay, coming back to the effects of time. So basically, the only significant effects that we observed between the three blocks in which participants played was that, in terms of coordination measures, was that the strength of relationship between participants decreased and the variability of relation increased. And I summarized this finding as a potential increase in free-form coordination. Because remember that participants' fluency ratings actually increased over time. So they didn't feel that their interaction would be less fluent or coordinated. But if we look at coordination measures, they actually show that participants were less coordinated over time. We also see an interesting interaction effect between sensory feedback modality and block. And I interpret this as sort of maybe as a slower learning for the more complex auditory feedback condition. So, and at the same, like related to that, a shift in focus over the time of the game. So in the beginning, people were maybe much more focused or happy with audio-visual play, which some participants described as sort of the natural and the complete variant of the game. And you can see that here. Actually, there is a problem with the, well, you can still read it, that's fine. So the fun rating was highest in the first block for the audio-visual condition. But then you can see this orange line, so the light orange line is sort of decreasing over time. And this means that fun ratings for audio-visual trials decreased over time. And the opposite is the case for the visual play and the auditory play. And I interpret this as sort of a transition. So first participants started out and they were really excited about audio-visual play, but maybe they have sort of ticked that box and then moved on and discovered visual play as something interesting. So maybe in the beginning it was more like, oh, we can just move two dashes left and right. But over time, they found ways of sort of playing games with each other and also maybe waving or associating things with how they were moving. And so visual play became something interesting over time. The same holds for auditory play in that it becomes more interesting later in the experiment. Okay, I will now shift and really talk more about the findings from the interviews I conducted in the end of the experiment. And I will emphasize in particular, as also the title of this event announced, this balance between being more synchronous and being aligned and being similar, and being different or having variety and more challenging aspects in the game. So where did we see this in the results from the interview? What I'm showing you here are the code counts from both the number. Basically, I'm showing how many players talked about, for example, synchrony or harmony as something that would contribute to a special moment of interaction with their partner. And so this this graph on the right-hand side shows everything that participants said about emotions. So there's one group of negative emotions in the more darker color, one group of comments around positive emotions on the lower right, and one group of comments about special moments that they had in their interaction. And what I wanted to highlight here is that there are really both elements that emphasize synchrony, harmony, sort of success and ability to like alignment, basically, and developing shared ideas and shared ways of understanding what they're doing. And also comments around laughter, which definitely includes positive relations between participants. But there were also comments about breaking harmony, being creative, introducing variety into the interaction dynamic. So really, basically positive emotions connected around breaking the pattern or introducing something new. And the same holds for the cluster of figuring out how they should orient in this world, let's say, of the mirror game. So there are again 3 clusters. So what the upper right one is really about the basic mode of playing. The lower right one is about patterns that they established between themselves as sort of like a shared vocabulary between the 2 players. And the left one is about personal interaction. So really this being a personal engaging and also a social interaction for them. So these are the 3 groups of comments. And again, we see comments that really relate to integrating, to balance, establishing a shared mode, being in synchrony, listening, following, and also these structured ways of interacting. So the patterns in themselves are in a way of being oriented and aligned as a team. And also we see these themes that relate more to difference. So I actually, to be transparent, my the Zoom faces cover part of my screen. So I mentioned the breaking harmony already in the previous plot, but it's shown here. I'm sorry for this glitch. But so I wanted to emphasize there is mention of breaking harmony, and even the fact that they have a diversity of patterns that they switch back and forth between is in a way an introduction of difference and variety into the interaction. And the same holds true for this theme of integration and balance. So it was a priority for participants to have a balanced interaction, so to not dominate, but to have an equal contribution. So to really consider what the other person wants also. So to wrap up, basically, what did I find through my research with the sonified mirror game? So I clearly could show that the sensory feedback modality has a strong impact on interpersonal coordination. The dynamics that people display are very different across the 3 different modalities. I also showed that leadership, so being either in the leadership or in the joint improvisation condition, made a difference to the interaction. So there was a general preference for joint improvisation, where participants felt there was more flexibility and more co-creative interaction. And we also saw, I didn't show this, actually this slide today, but the synchrony levels are higher for joint improvisation, whereas all other measures of coordination tend to be higher in the leader-follower relations. Which is why I state here that in leader-follower trials, participants tend to be more strongly coordinated, but they prefer joint improvisation trials where they have more flexibility and more space for co-creative interaction. Okay, and now to recap really the changes over time. So there was a significant predictor of block in the model of fluency. So fluency tends to increase over time, in spite of this decrease in coordination that we see. So the variability of relation tended to increase over time, and the strength of relation tended to decrease. And I really want to sort of summarize and emphasize these findings again as a relevance of both synchrony and difference for engaging social interactions. So we see this in the velocity differences that contribute to fun but reduce fluency, both of which are aspects of successful social interactions. As I just said, there is an increase in fluency while movement becomes less coordinated. And from the interview data, we really also learned that participants tried to make something interesting happen while staying oriented. So the auditory feedback condition was very challenging, I think, for participants, and maybe only got interesting towards the end of the game, because it was very difficult to orient in this condition. So there seems to be really this sweet spot between feeling oriented, being able to coordinate, being able to orient and express yourself in the environment. And once you have this, once you tick this box, you really care about trying to going beyond. So making something interesting and also entertaining in this social space. I now wanted to also introduce, talk a little bit about how I care about or learned about embodied cognition outside the lab. So during my PhD, I was part of 2 different initiatives, as Johanna mentioned. So I first worked on a project called the Playful Academic. And also then I got involved with other people, some of whom are present now in the Mindful Researchers Initiative. And both of these projects really asked how we can include embodied and participatory aspects in the everyday task of a researcher, or in what it means to do research. And the first project, so the Playful Academic, was an article that basically provides tools, so simple scripts that can be used by researchers to include some of these resources really in how they collaborate or also how you would prepare a presentation or design an experiment. So the intention was to make skills or practices such as just grounding or even Feldenkrais, so being noticing movements and also becoming, basically relaxing also maybe tensions through attention to the body, or also tools such as reflection questions or slow reading, really noticing what your experience is like when you digest a text. So different kinds of tools basically that make embodied and participatory dimensions accessible to researchers. That was really the intention. So the first was this article, but then also the Mindful Researchers Initiative was really the attempt to open a space, to open a dialogue between researchers who care about this. And then over time, we held several listening circles, so a structured group dialogue to facilitate exchange around these themes and also to learn about maybe the needs and interests of people who care about this. And we also presented our findings or our practices at conferences. So we organized a conference track as part of ESRI, and we also participated in the APA Division 24 meeting to introduce perspectives on enaction, and share about our work. So these were really, and I think to me there's this interesting combination. So I really care about the specific findings or the specific lessons I can learn from a controlled experimental setting, but I also find it very important to keep the relationship to the phenomenon that I actually want to study alive. So learn about social engagement really happening out there. How can I facilitate this? And also to implement some of the insights that we maybe gain as researchers to really work immediately also on implementing these ideas. And so these initiatives were focused on that, or still are. Yes. Okay, so I would like to introduce sort of three general themes, three general clusters of conclusions or things that are important that I learned from both my empirical investigations and also these initiatives that I engaged in outside of the lab. And the first theme evolves around the importance of context and time. So as I already talked about a bit a minute ago, first things first. So when we enter a social setting, we first need to acquire the basic skills that it takes to orient here. So in case of my games, people had to learn to steer the ball in the ball game, and they also had to understand the joint improvisation, like the mirror game, before they could then move on and care about the social interaction dynamic. I also learned through both experiments and the initiatives that the environment is really the stage for collaboration. So this refers to very simple things such as objects or the space that you can move in a social interaction, so in a virtual place or in a real setting. So coordination and interaction tends to gather around objects. So it matters which objects you provide. And the same holds maybe for more abstract gatherings. So when we meet, so in the mirror game, I really learned that participants try to resolve this ambiguity of what are we doing here by establishing patterns of moving. So they really had these sort of maybe moving at set distances or increasing this continuous increase in the speed of movement. So they try to establish a vocabulary of patterns that they can use then to orient in the situation together. And in parallel, I would draw a parallel really then again to when we have discussions or meetings. It's very helpful to provide a structure such as you would in a listening circle, where you provide general guidelines. You also tell people clearly in which ways they can participate, so that sort of the frame is clear, and then people feel more ready to contribute within it. I also learned about temporal dynamics. So I could see in both of my experiments that social engagement or social coordination established itself over time and over different dimensions of time. And one of these, one example or one evidence that I showed in this talk now is that maybe the focus shifted. So first it was interesting to play in the audiovisual realm, and then it got more interesting to play in the visual. So this is also how temporal dynamics matter to social interactions. And this is just one example, but yeah, I think it's very important that this temporal dependency is considered when we study social engagement. So even this balance that I was trying to emphasize between synchrony and variability, this is something that is determined over time and reset over time. So something that satisfies this balance in the beginning may not do so after like 5 minutes of having explored this point. And it's also true if we put a novice or an expert in the same situation. Of course, they will find the sweet spot in a different place. The second point that I wanted to emphasize is balance. So really this sweet spot, what does it mean? It means that it's very important to listen and to get to know the other. And I really learned that also from my participant interviews, that they spend a lot of time trying to understand what the other cares about, and even maybe giving space for like offering the opportunity for the other person to shape the interaction dynamic. So this is usually a good thing to then arrive at a sweet spot between your own and the other's contribution. There's also this element that was very strong of introducing challenge, variety, and surprise. So once you get oriented and you start to understand what the other person cares about, there were a lot of instances even of like clownish or tricking the other person and challenging them in a way in order to keep the interaction dynamic engaging. And finally, I wanted to emphasize this theme of integration. So not only did I try to design my experiments in a way that is relevant, so that people are engaged as they are in the experiment and maybe also learn something that matters to them through the ways in which I assess experience, for example. But also, I think it's very relevant when we study something as complex as social engagement that there are like iterative cycles of analysis. So different methods. In my case, I used interviews, I had ratings, and I also had these behavioral measures of coordination. And they provide different perspectives on what is happening in the game. And I think it's very useful and even important to really move through these different perspectives and come to a final understanding that integrates them in order to have sort of like a valid and useful account of what is happening. I also think it's really important to do this with multiple researchers. So I just wanted to highlight that it was very important also. Maybe this is in general, research should be done by teams. But especially if the subject of interest is so complex, I think it's very important to have these loops between multiple researchers. And as Johanna also said, so this talk, I wanted to share something about my path, basically. And I thought I would try 3 different ways of talking about my path. So the first way, so as Johanna said, I did a bachelor in liberal arts and science. Then I learned really a lot about neuroscientific methods. And in my PhD, I went on to design these experiments to relate social engagement to interpersonal dynamics. And how would I describe this? So there was a strong emphasis on designing engaging experiments already in the research projects that I did as part of my master's. And over time, I really acquired, or I built a mixed methods toolbox. So it became very important for me to learn what I just talked about the integration of different methods. It's a real effort. So of course it's more demanding and more time consuming to integrate methods. It takes more time than just doing every method individually. There's real work in integrating them, but I think it's very valuable and really needed for subjects such as social engagement. And I also learned, I think, through this path to rely on like long-term work. So in particular, so the data sets that I collected now, they are very comprehensive. So I really looked at social interaction across different levels. And it will take me a while until I'm done analyzing them, but I think it's a valuable project. And yeah, so just like a lesson learned for myself, I think it makes sense to spend some time with the data that you acquired. So rather collect something interesting and then spend time with it. And in relation to that, also to rely on sort of collaborations that survive over the long term. So I'm already in exchange with one of my colleagues over years. So not every week or not even every month, even though recently we are, but like really to also sustain these collaborations and stay, like find people who care about a similar research question and stay in touch with them and exchange about what you learn over the years. Or yeah, I think something really develops, like something valuable can develop in these long-term collaborations. Another perspective on my path is very closely related to mine in life, actually. So I first attended the European Summer Research Institute in 2017, and I saw there was a screening of the movie about Varela's life, and it really resonated with me and sort of woke me up concerning that I should ask my questions through the research that I do. And subsequently, I also applied for a Varela Award, which is why I'm talking to you now. And that gave me really a boost and like, yeah, daring to follow my own questions. And that is also sort of the conclusion that I want to, or the highlights that I want to derive from this perspective on my path. Yeah, so I'm really saying develop and follow up your personal research questions, build a network around them, and organize yourselves. So it's very meaningful. So I think the conclusions, like the precise conclusions, or even describing what were we doing as mindful researchers, or what am I about to do with my with this enactive research group that I'm engaged in, is difficult and fuzzy, but it's still it's very meaningful. So it gives me a space to develop thoughts with like-minded people, and like a protected space, you could say, to develop something that is important to me, and that I can, as it sort of becomes stronger over time, I can also then learn to bring this into the other contexts that I'm involved in. I also really think that these fuzzy engagements, they really help, like they develop my perspective that I have on my very quantitative data. So it helps me guide my quantitative research and also interpret the findings that I then have. Yeah. And the third perspective that I wanted to offer on my path is maybe very different. So I wanted to say that for me, it was also personally very important to get in touch with the community of contact improvisation, or it's like a modern dance form. And designing the mirror game, I really took a lot of, like I learned a lot about interpersonal dynamics and what skills it could take to maybe even dare to make and break rules through my experience in contact improvisation. It also is a way for me to embody embodied cognition, and it's certainly very grounding and rewarding. And the same is true for gardening. So over the past 2 or 3 years, I started a little project to take care of a garden and build a little garden house. And yesterday I actually received some solar panels for my garden. And the same holds for my hobbies in construction and sewing. So really to make use of what's available and to explore to explore. So I note here also down drawing, non-conceptual reflection. So my friend Lisa Streeter, she really encouraged me to just draw intuitively, and later look at what I drew and try to, like, so for example, draw your PhD. And then I was just drawing, and then I looked at what I had done and I learned something about it through that. So it's just one example, but yeah, I think it's very, like, it supports resilience and learning to engage in these different modes of exploration. I also put on here cycling adventures and hosting bike packers. I mean, for different reasons. I think it just fits sort of my idea of like living life at my own pace. It was a very rewarding experience to do a very far bike trip, sleep outside, and the same holds actually now. I'm in this community of bikepackers, and now I get people to sleep here in Hamburg when I'm home, and usually they are very interesting personalities who live a different kind of life. Maybe because if you want to fit traveling far distances into your life, you tend not to have the standard 9-to-5 job. So I think this is really fueling my inspiration and also my sort of strength to do research, that because I think what I said before about integrating different methods, it's not something that people will have open arms for in all of the places. Like, they want to be successful in the established disciplines. That's how you survive. So when you come along and you say, shouldn't we consider this very different perspective, which also talks about the same thing, then they go like, no, that's not reliable, or we don't trust in these methods. So there's like an inherent resistance to integrating different views. But I think it's really rewarding to do it in itself, and I think it's also very important in terms of the quality of the work that you do. And things like this on this path, they sort of maybe give me the energy and the grounding to keep on doing these things, keep on pushing for integration. All right. Yeah, what's next? Path continues into the future, I guess. So yeah, apologies, I might have been a little bit exhausted because I had actually a 3-hour job interview before this talk. So that might be next. I might be joining a group on mechanisms of learning and change in Hamburg. I also plan to do another long bike trip and join a conference on playful research, launch this enactive research group project, and certainly continue my work as a trainer with HFP. Yeah, so I feel I have settled more like over the course of this presentation. Now I feel very present. All right, and this brings me actually to the moment of my talk. So before we talk to each other maybe about things that I mentioned in my talk, and this would also give me the opportunity to maybe clarify some things that were not so clear before, I would invite us to delve into a group activity. So basically 2 different kinds of mirror games that we could play. And the first one will involve, basically we will start by following. So we will just mimic one other person that we see on the screen, and we will just do this for just 2 minutes. Yeah, and maybe it makes sense to just tell you about the rest when we have finished this. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And yes. All right, so all of the participants with video on, which are, I can see 5 people. The idea would be that we each pin someone else. So Johanna, you would be pinning me. I will pin Gabor, and Gabor will pin Mary. And Mary will pin Willeke, and Willeke would pin Johanna, so that we are basically set up in a circle. And for the next 2 minutes, so now we should each see one person like pinned in a big screen. So, and now you will just mimic the expressions of the person that you can see on the screen. Okay, maybe I have to work on my introduction of this method. Okay. Let's just come back into a gallery view.
It worked.
So basically my plan for now was that we would just go into breakout rooms, so with two people. I don't know if the other people who don't have their video on, if they're basically with us or if you're just listening in. So the idea would be that we now have just a moment of time, maybe to say until 10 past, so just 7 minutes to exchange in pairs before we talk as a whole group. All right, so maybe we could still do that just until 10 past. I don't know, Johanna, can you set us up just in 2 breakout rooms?
What do we exchange about? Or are you going to explain that?
Yeah, just basically an opportunity to reflect about the talk, anything that is sort of present. And yeah, the idea would just be to, I mean, I originally wanted to take this mirroring exercise also into the breakout group. So we start just the first minute by playing with this idea of mirroring and then go into talking. And maybe we could still do that. And I mean, I wanted to sort of offer this this possibility of exchanging through movement or like moving together as an alternative to talking. So to sort of keep that option at hand as you're exchanging, but to focus on whatever is most interesting. So if there's something that you want to exchange, you could exchange, or if mirroring is exciting at the moment, you could also spend more time with that.
Okay, I'll launch the groups then, Annika.
Yeah.
So shall we close the breakout rooms?
Yes.
They're being closed. I think they'll all return in just a minute or so.
So maybe we could just have, I mean, we don't have so much time left, but maybe we could have comments or questions, impressions, anything.
Related to your talk, Annika, or related to this experience?
I think, I mean, whatever is most relevant now.
Yes. I know that we had nice questions raised in our discussion with Vileka, so there will be some questions, I'm sure. But maybe before that, we can hear some reflections about this little game and the dialogue. Whoever would like to share some. Mary, you wanted to say something?
I would just say I enjoyed my time with Philip. We continued with the mirroring, and I just really enjoyed it. It's a great play and a great way to get acquainted. And then we talked a little bit and some questions came up, but the main thing I wanted to say is how much fun it was. Pleasurable. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Any further comments to the game?
For me, the game was also really fun, and I was wondering, like I have a question about the experiment. Like now we were like interacting with like at least the upper part of our bodies, and in the experiment, like how did people actually interact? Like they saw a screen, and then did they press some buttons or move a mouse or something?
They were standing in front of each other. So they were basically set up at a table and standing in front of each other, and there was a wooden screen, so they could see their faces, but they did not see directly their hand movements. And the hand movements, so they were using a pen on a tablet, basically, to move an avatar left and right. So you could say they were also sort of improvising or jointly moving with their whole body, but really the interaction was just about this avatar that they're moving left and right on the tablet.
But they could see each other as well, faces. They could, yeah.
I know that Vileka has some good questions, so maybe we can start with one of them.
Yes, that's interesting that you explain it, how that happened, because my questions were related to safety and sensing, because I guess this setup is partly a kind of real life and partly it's I've forgotten the word. I don't know. It's a very basic word, but like it's an online kind of interaction. Online is not the right word, but you know what I mean. But I could feel myself, like in any kind of interaction, I would be first looking for safety. How safe am I with this person? And I was wondering, if you thought about that, or how you managed that, or how maybe it impacted on the interaction. And the other is related to sensing. I guess they could partly do sensing because they saw each other. They weren't allowed to talk, maybe, but if you're in the same room, then you can use sensing. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult concept, of course, sensing. What are you doing exactly when you do sensing? But so I was wondering how that comes into that, and so how it applies to real life settings. I don't know if that's clear. But...
I will touch on the first question first, and then maybe ask you to clarify the second one, maybe. So the issue of safety, I mean, what comes to mind first is that they did have time to try out the sound environment individually first. So maybe they could explore a little bit, and they did get to know each other a little bit through the joint interviews or the joint instruction that I was giving. And to some extent, like just giving them an overview, and so they knew what was sort of happening. They had instructions and we had a dialogue about it. That to me all sort of counts towards the safety. And I mean, some participants, and then the second comment would be about individual differences, that maybe also be having any sort of experience with music or improvisation, or any type of improvisation would then give you the feeling of safety, I think, in this context, to really try things out, because you feel like you know what this is about a bit more. Because some people were even, let's say, felt safe enough to close their eyes in the auditory only condition, because to some extent you don't need to look at what you're doing, you only have the sound. So to me that feels like they were safe, like they felt safe to explore. But it also relates to preferences. So not only how ready do I feel to explore, but how much do I like moving in a maybe more chaotic way. So maybe that is what comes to mind first about safety. But I think it's it's something that if I think about future work, I would like to find out how to provide, like how to create a container where people indeed feel safe to explore. So I think it will be definitely an important aspect of my future work. I do find it challenging, actually, like if I'm very transparent, even like things like facilitating this little exploration on Zoom. I mean, it's also over time you gain experience, but it takes a certain orientedness on my behalf also to hold a space like that for you. And maybe today I also felt like, well, I shouldn't, so it's a learning process, I think. And this,
Yeah, if I wasn't commenting on your ability to create a safe space. I was just wondering, anybody would be looking to see how safe am I with this person. So how this would come into how they interact with each other. That's how I meant it. Yeah.
Yes, we are looking for more questions. I do have maybe two in the meantime. Just want to make sure that we don't have more questions in the group, or there are more, but we can still wait for them to arise. So I can just ask then one more theoretical and one more practical question. When you gave the instruction to the participants, did you ask them to try to get synchronized?
No, I mean, there was a bit of a by design push towards synchrony through the sonification, so through the sound, because you had to be synchronized in order to hear the orchestra sound. But the instruction was to create interesting movements and sounds together. So you could interpret that as, like, it's a bit open to interpretation. You could interpret that as move in the same way, but you could also be a bit more free in your interpretation and just, and many participants, especially over time, developed, like as I also pointed out, like more free form modes of collaborating, or even if it's systematic, to move differently, like to move exactly the opposite way, or to do things in a row, like turn-taking dynamics. So different ways of being coordinated. So
coordination and collaboration came naturally as a byproduct, or as a phenomenon from the interaction itself.
Yes. I mean, I think people were really looking for ways to structure this, like to resolve the ambiguity, or resolve the lack of structure by creating structure together.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And do you see any wider, longer term consequence to that phenomenon, that we tend to get organized, we tend to get synchronized, we tend to get coordinated or collaborating almost naturally by default? I mean, did you draw any conclusion like that, or it's too wild to conclude like that? It would require further investigations and research.
I mean, my first response to your suggestion now would be that given the different kind of findings that I have and also the two experiments, it seems that complexity or difference is actually good for both sort of the success of an interaction and also for it being engaging and interesting over time. So that would make me be interested in mechanisms to encourage exploration. So maybe that would be my take on it, or my priority, let's say, around this. So how can we, maybe also related to Villeke's question, how can we create a space that is safe so that people do not just fall into synchrony or, let's say, comply with the norms, but feel safe to suggest what they would enjoy most or what they are interested in?
That's very interesting. Thank you, Annika. And then one final question. You mentioned two initiatives that you are involved in. One is the Mindful Researchers and the other one is the Enactive Research Group. And I wonder how and what type of difference you see between the two terms here. What is their relationship between, I mean, the relationship between mindfulness or being mindful on the one hand, and an action or being enactive on the other? We always consider these two notions ourselves at Mind and Life Europe as central to our work, and we always switch from one to the other, but we see that they are kind of distinct or different. One would emphasize something and the other would emphasize something different or something else. But I would be curious to hear your perspective on the difference between these two approaches.
Yes. I mean, I would first go with my, like, what is my, I can just share what my take is. So intuitively, I associate more with mindful, maybe more contemplative or more like calm and grounded and settled, or like maybe aware, but it's maybe it has an inner quality to me. So, and it's also a bit soft or slow. Let's say it's very like it's not very and the enactive to me, it's more about the relationship to the world. So really implementing and being influenced, like co-creating, participating. So it has a much more active connotation for me. Much more connected to other people. More mindful is more noticing, and enaction is more learning by doing or involving and emerging in relationship to others.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you so much. Any more questions from the group here or friends?
I have one more question.
Yes, please.
You mentioned the expression as successful interaction or success in interaction, and like I think it's quite difficult to define, or like, but what does it mean to you, especially in your experiment or also in other collaborative interactions?
Yes, what does it mean to me? I will start there. So I would find a successful interaction. So it really connects to the things that we already discussed, basically like safety and co-creativity. So bringing something to the interaction that you actually care about, or learning something about yourself that you didn't realize before. So this, I guess for me, they are a bit placeholders. So successful and engaging are very close for me personally. But you can also, of course, look at, and especially in the experiment that I did not present today, I could look at the success at the task. of people collaborating. So I could define it as a function of performance. So when you have to collect coins, then success is collecting many coins. So when you have a particular task, of course, it's easy to define success. Yeah, but personally, I'm interested in the sort of engaging and co-creative interactions. That would be a successful one for me.
Thanks, Philip. Then maybe one final question, Annika. If you look back at your work over the years with the Varela grant and with the Ph.D. and everything you have been doing over the years in this research project, how would you consider, or what would you consider the biggest gift or learning for yourself that you gained from this research, this period of work, this engagement?
I mean, I think I touched on these on many gifts that I see in how I talked about my path in different ways. So I would consider all of them sort of gifts or fruits from this work. But if I now remember, like, try to settle or reformulate, yeah, I think it's the bridge. So basically, the possibility that I now see for connecting to an existing domain of work, let's say cognitive science research, but I have found the ingredients, or I have built my own tools so that I can bring in the things that I find meaningful. So I basically managed to prepare myself to work on integration. So across domains that I find interesting. So I've come to a position, or I've come to a place where I'm in the position of actually doing this. Yeah, or even other people calling me out. So I'm thinking very concretely about my PhD evaluation tomorrow. So I think this would be the gift. I hope I was somewhat clear.
Thank you so much. You have already gifted us with your work and research, and hopefully tomorrow you will be gifted with the proper, nice evaluation of your thesis. And also maybe with another gift that you can continue doing this work professionally in your postdoc career. So we wish you all the best and real success, I would say. The way you understand and the way you interpret success. And thank you so much for your contributions to our work at Mind & Life Europe over the years, both as a researcher and as participant and contributor to the ESRI, the events, the Summer Research Institutes. And we hope to have you back in the coming years as well.
Thank you,
Wish you also a nice journey to Athens and a bike tour across Europe as you did last year as well.
Thanks.
And on that note, I would just hand over back to you, Johanna, sharing our upcoming program with you all.
Thank you, Gabor, and thank you so much again, Annika. And so yes, on that note, this talk rounds out our spring series of online programming. Pick up again in the fall, in mid-September. So look out for the next online public talk, mid-September. But this summer, we'll host our flagship programs in person in Pomaya, Italy. So the ESRI, European Summer Research Institute, and the Emily Retreat. This year, really focusing on the theme of caring for life, sentience, and responsibility in critical times. So the application period has closed, but we look forward to possibly seeing you there and also maybe in future years too. So thank you so much once again, Annika. And have a good evening, everyone. Thank